They told me to wait at the back. In front of a crowded gate, with strangers watching, I swallowed the sting of humiliation. I could hear the chuckles, feel the sharp judgment slicing through me like glass. To them, I was just another passenger, too young, too black, too invisible. But they had no idea. Behind the garment bag on my shoulder was the uniform that carried 4 golden stripes. They thought they were dismissing me. What they didn't know was that I wasn't waiting for a seat. I was commanding the flight, and everything was about to change. The airport terminal always carried a particular weight before a long-haul flight. To most, it was the hum of rolling luggage, the smell of coffee drifting from the kiosks, the occasional announcement echoing through the PA system. For me, it was different. Every walk through those polished floors reminded me of the countless times I had been underestimated, doubted, or quietly pushed aside. I had trained myself to wear calmness like a second skin. My weapon wasn't volume or anger. It was silence sharpened by experience. That morning, I carried my garment bag and my flight case through the side entrance reserved for crew. My posture was deliberate, collected, careful not to draw attention, but not to shrink either. The irony was, I knew attention would find me whether I wanted it or not. I stepped into the briefing room, where flight attendants and co-pilots gathered before every departure. A semicircle of uniforms filled the space, neatly pressed blazers, scarves tied at precise angles, and epaulettes gleaming under fluorescent lights. Conversations broke into laughter here and there, the easy camaraderie of colleagues who thought they already knew how the day would unfold. I moved toward an empty chair near the back, placing my bag quietly at my feet. Then came the voice, sharp, clipped, and dripping with authority born from years of seniority. "Excuse me," she said, turning her gaze directly at me. "Passengers wait outside. This is crew only." Her name tag glinted against the navy fabric. Linda Harris, senior flight attendant. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, her expression carved into permanent disapproval. She didn't even bother to glance at the ID badge hanging from my neck, though it was plain in sight. Her eyes lingered on my brown skin, my natural curls pinned neatly, my simple blouse instead of a uniform. That was all she needed to decide who I was and who I wasn't. The room stilled. Heads turned. A few flight attendants shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In the corner, 2 men in expensive suits, VIP passengers traveling first class, smirked into their phones, clearly entertained by the spectacle. The silence stretched, thick enough to choke. I held her stare for a moment, my heartbeat steady, my expression unreadable. Years of practice, years of swallowing humiliation in places just like this. "I'm not a passenger," I said quietly, my voice firm but low. Linda's lips pressed thin. She waved a hand dismissively, her tone louder this time so the room could hear. "If your staff, wait at the back with the rest of the junior attendants. This briefing is for senior crew." The words struck harder than I let on. She hadn't mistaken me. She had decided what I was allowed to be. To her, a black woman in plain clothes couldn't possibly be anything beyond the lowest rung of the ladder. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the urge to answer, to correct her on the spot. But I didn't. Instead, I gathered my bag and stepped aside, retreating toward the wall with measured calm. Behind me, the 2 suited passengers chuckled audibly. "Guess diversity hires start in the cabin service," one muttered, just loud enough for the group to catch. Laughter rippled through a few others, nervous but real. I stood still, letting the sting sink deep but not show on my face. To fight here now would feed into their prejudice. To argue would confirm the caricature they expected me to play. I had learned long ago that silence was more powerful than shouting. My silence wasn't weakness. It was a blade I would draw later, when it mattered. The briefing continued without me. Linda spoke crisply about safety protocols, gate numbers, the expected boarding time. She addressed everyone else with professional respect, but her gaze never flicked back to me. To her, I had already been erased. The room flowed with nods and scribbled notes, while I remained an outsider in plain sight. Yet as the minutes ticked, my mind wandered to the uniform folded neatly in my garment bag. 4 golden stripes stitched into dark fabric, symbols that carried the weight of thousands of flight hours, simulations, certifications, nights away from home. The quiet ache of proving myself over and over again. To them, those stripes meant power, authority, command. To me, they meant survival. Every one of them was earned in silence against storms both in the sky and on the ground. When the briefing concluded, the crew dispersed. Laughter and chatter resumed, brushing away the tension as though it hadn't happened. Linda moved quickly, clipboard tucked under her arm, avoiding even a glance in my direction. The VIP passengers passed by, smirking as though they had witnessed some kind of entertainment. I let them walk, my face still composed. I picked up my garment bag, the weight suddenly heavier than it had been minutes before. I walked out of the room, each step echoing against the tile floor, my shoulders squared. On the outside, I was calm. Inside, a storm was forming. Every humiliation I had endured in my career, every dismissal of my abilities, every whisper questioning how I got my position, they all condensed into this moment. The difference was that today the proof of who I was rested in my hands. And when the time came, no dismissal, no prejudice, no smirk would be able to stand against it. As I moved toward the restroom to change, I passed a mirror in the hallway. For a brief moment, I caught my own reflection, poised, restrained, silent. My jaw tightened. I whispered to myself so quietly no one else could hear. Patience. Just a little longer. Because they thought they had seen the whole story in that room. They thought they knew who I was. But the truth was waiting, folded neatly in dark fabric, stitched with 4 golden stripes. And soon, very soon, the storm outside would pale compared to the storm that was coming for them. The restroom smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale perfume. A fluorescent light flickered overhead, humming faintly as if it too had grown weary of the endless cycle of departures and arrivals. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, and set the garment bag gently on the counter. My reflection stared back at me in the cracked mirror. Plain clothes, weary eyes, a posture too accustomed to being underestimated. The sting of Linda's words still echoed. Wait at the back with the others. With deliberate hands, I unzipped the garment bag. The uniform emerged like a second skin waiting to be claimed. Dark navy fabric, pressed sharp, shoulders padded just so. But my eyes went immediately to the epaulets. 4 golden stripes gleaming under the weak bathroom light. They were more than threads sewn into cloth. They were armor forged in sacrifice. Every hour logged in the cockpit, every grueling simulator exam, every condescending instructor who assumed I'd fail before I even started. They all lived in those stripes. I slipped the jacket on, button by button, smoothing it across my torso. The weight was immediate, heavier than cotton should ever feel, because it carried the memories of those who had told me I didn't belong. I pinned my ID in place, double-checking the letters. Captain Olivia Carter. There was a power in reading my own name, a reminder that no one could strip this from me. For a moment, I closed my eyes and inhaled. Behind my lids, I saw flashes of my father's workshop, grease-stained hands guiding mine as he explained the parts of an engine, his voice firm but proud. He had told me once, "They'll doubt you twice as much, so you'll have to work 4 times as hard. But when you sit in that cockpit, none of them can deny who you are." He had been right. I opened my eyes and stared at the woman in the mirror again. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't waiting at the back. She was command. Gathering my bag, I walked out of the restroom and back down the hallway toward the briefing room. The air seemed to change with each step, my pace steady, each footfall echoing louder in my mind. When I pushed the door open, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Heads turned. I didn't have to say a word. The uniform said it for me. Linda's eyes widened first, disbelief flickering before her face stiffened into something colder, harder. She clutched her clipboard as though it were a shield. The color drained from her cheeks. For a heartbeat, the entire room was silent, the weight of recognition settling heavy in the air. I set my flight case down deliberately, the sound of it hitting the floor sharp against the silence. Straightening my shoulders, I let my gaze sweep the room once before speaking. "Good morning," I said evenly. "I'm Captain Olivia Carter. I'll be commanding this flight." The words cracked through the silence like thunder. Gasps, nervous coughs, and shifting feet filled the room. A young flight attendant near the back looked down quickly, embarrassed. The two VIP businessmen exchanged startled glances. Even Ryan Cooper, my co-pilot, leaned back slightly in his chair as though trying to reassess everything he thought he knew. Linda, however, stood frozen. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, but nothing came out. The silence from her was louder than any words. For a moment, I allowed the pause to stretch, watching them process, watching the humiliation they had so easily thrown at me rebound in quiet shock. My uniform had done nothing more than reveal the truth that had always been there. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow in the heavy air. "Well," he said, his voice light but his eyes tight. "This should be interesting." He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His body leaned back casually, but his jaw tightened in subtle resistance. It wasn't blatant, it wasn't loud, but I recognized it. The small gestures of dismissal, the hidden doubts that carried just as much weight as open insults. Ryan wasn't Linda. He wasn't brash or cruel in words, but he didn't believe in me either. His smirk said it all. "Let's see if you can handle this." I gave him no reaction, only a small nod, acknowledging his presence without feeding his doubt. "Briefing's over, but we'll have a pre-flight check in 30 minutes. I expect everyone at their stations." My voice was calm, authoritative. No hesitation, no opening for them to question who commanded this flight. Linda finally found her voice, though it trembled at the edges. "Of course, Captain," she said, the word forced from her lips as though it were poison. She turned quickly, gathering her papers, avoiding eye contact. The crew began to disperse, but the air was different now, uneasy. Every glance I caught was tinged with a mix of surprise, discomfort, maybe even respect. But it was respect born from revelation, not belief. They hadn't expected me, hadn't wanted me, and though they couldn't deny the stripes on my shoulders, they still doubted whether I deserved them. As the room emptied, I stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle again. My heart beat steady, my face composed, but inside, I could feel the tension rising. The first twist had landed, the revelation of who I was. But this wasn't the end of their doubt. It was only the beginning. I gathered my case and headed for the jet bridge, the sound of my heels against the floor like a drumbeat. Outside, through the windows, the aircraft waited, massive, gleaming, ready. My domain, whether they liked it or not. Still, I knew the fight was far from over. Linda had been rattled, but not defeated. Ryan had smiled, but it wasn't the smile of camaraderie. And Richard Collins hadn't yet arrived, the man who could make or break a career with a single line in a report. The armor was on, but the battle hadn't started. Not yet. And as I walked down the corridor toward the waiting storm, I whispered to myself again, quieter this time but sharper, like a blade unsheathed. Patience. Because this was only the first strike. The war for respect had only just begun. The walk down the jet bridge was always a private ritual for me. The sound of my shoes on the metal floor, the faint draft of air seeping in through the sealed doors, the glimpse of the aircraft's nose through the window. All of it usually filled me with a quiet thrill. This was the moment when I stepped from the noise of the terminal into the sanctuary of command. But that morning, even wrapped in my uniform, the thrill was tempered by the weight of eyes that had already measured me and found me lacking. Inside the aircraft, the cabin lights glowed a sterile white. Flight attendants bustled about, tucking blankets into overhead bins, checking oxygen masks, running through their practiced routines. Linda Harris stood near the boarding door, her posture rigid, her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. As the first passengers began to trickle in, she leaned down toward a couple settling into business class. Her voice dropped, but I was close enough to catch the words. "Don't worry," she whispered conspiratorially, her tone dripping with false reassurance. "The real pilot is Ryan Cooper. You're in good hands." My jaw tightened, but my face remained unreadable. I continued down the aisle, clipboard in hand, as though I hadn't heard. Years of training had taught me that sometimes silence spoke louder than protest. Yet the words branded themselves into my mind, another tally on the list of slights I carried. Linda hadn't simply disrespected me in the briefing room. She was actively undermining me in front of passengers. Passengers who would now step onto this aircraft believing their safety depended not on the woman with 4 stripes, but on the man who sat second in command. I paused near the galley, reviewing checklists, my expression calm though my pulse drummed steadily. Ryan joined me, flipping through his own logbook. He offered another of those half smiles, the kind that wasn't friendly but wasn't openly hostile either. "Ready for a smooth ride, Captain?" he asked, the title forced, his tone carrying the faintest trace of mockery. "Always," I replied, my voice even. I didn't look up from my list. Before the exchange could stretch into silence, a figure stepped through the boarding door. His presence shifted the air immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform trimmed in silver insignia rather than gold. Richard Collins, Flight Operations Manager. His reputation preceded him, stern, calculating, a man whose loyalty bent not toward fairness, but toward those who held the purse strings. "Captain Carter," he said loudly, his voice carrying easily over the hum of passengers stowing bags. His gaze swept the cabin before settling on me, sharp and measuring. "I'll be riding along for the briefing and early checks. We've got high-profile passengers on board, and the company wants to ensure everything runs perfectly." It wasn't a request. It was surveillance, dressed in polite phrasing. The crew stiffened at his words, some casting sidelong glances at me. Linda's lips twitched with the faintest smile, quickly suppressed. I nodded once, controlled. "Of course, Mr. Collins. Safety and precision are always my priority." He leaned closer, lowering his voice only I could hear, though the chill in his words was unmistakable. "Remember, Captain, today, the VIPs are more important than the schedule, more important than delays, more important than excuses." The implication was clear. Bend the rules, cut corners, do whatever kept the wealthy passengers happy. My silence stretched for a beat too long before I answered. "Safety is never an excuse," I said evenly. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further. Ryan cleared his throat awkwardly, glancing between us. "I'll head to the cockpit, Captain," he offered, as though trying to diffuse the tension. I gestured for him to go ahead, then followed, my spine straight, though the weight on my shoulders grew heavier with each step. Inside the cockpit, the familiar scent of leather and electronics wrapped around me. The panels gleamed with quiet readiness, switches and dials waiting for my touch. Normally, this space gave me peace. Today, it felt like a stage where every move would be scrutinized, every decision questioned. Richard slid into the jump seat behind me, his clipboard already out, pen poised. A silent judge in my own domain. As I ran through the pre-flight checklist with Ryan, I kept my tone calm and precise, but I felt the doubt pressing in from all sides. Linda whispering poison into passengers' ears. Ryan's smirk, a challenge wrapped in civility. Richard's surveillance, reminding me with every scratch of his pen that my authority was provisional, conditional. Outside, boarding announcements echoed through the cabin. Luggage thudded into bins. The hum of conversation drifted faintly through the closed cockpit door. On the surface, everything looked normal. But beneath the surface, fault lines spread wider with each passing minute. I checked the flight management system, entering coordinates, adjusting headings. My hands moved smoothly, practiced. Yet the silence behind me pressed like a weight. At one point, Richard cleared his throat. "You've logged enough hours on this route, haven't you?" The question was framed casually, but the edge was there. "Yes," I replied without looking back. "More than enough." He scribbled something on his clipboard. I exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the illuminated panels before me. They could whisper, smirk, undermine, and scribble until their pens ran dry. But soon, when the engines roared and the wheels lifted from the ground, all that would matter was whether this aircraft flew true. And I intended to make certain it did. Still, as I tightened my harness and adjusted the yoke, I felt the sting of isolation. I was the captain, yet in this moment, surrounded by doubt, I was also very much alone. And though the uniform I wore was armor, armor could still dent under enough pressure. The cockpit always felt like a cathedral to me, quiet, vast, humming with unseen power. I had walked into countless cockpits in my career, but sliding into the left seat still carried a certain gravity. The captain's chair wasn't just a seat. It was command, responsibility, the place where life and death balanced on steady hands. Ryan settled into the right seat, his movements casual, almost careless, as though the routine mattered less than the performance. Behind us, Richard Collins sat rigid in the jump seat, clipboard ready, pen angled like a weapon. The silence of his scrutiny pressed against my back. We began the pre-flight sequence. My hands moved over the panels, switches flicking with practiced ease, each step ingrained into muscle memory. Ryan mirrored my actions, but his timing lagged, his eyes wandering. He seemed distracted, or perhaps he wanted me to notice his lack of care. Then the screen flickered. The navigation display stuttered, a warning code flashing red across the monitor. "FMS input error," Ryan muttered, frowning. His fingers flew over the keypad, entering a string of corrections. "Too fast, too sloppy." "That's not the right sequence," I said calmly, my hand intercepting his. He shot me a quick glance, his smile thin. "I've got it." "No, you don't." My voice stayed even but firm. I leaned forward, canceling his last entry, and keyed in the proper override. The screen steadied, red warnings dissolving into the calm green of restored systems. The silence stretched. Ryan leaned back, lips pressing into a smirk he didn't quite manage to hold. "Well," he muttered, "lucky save, Captain." "Not luck," I replied, my gaze fixed on the display. "Procedure." Behind us, Richard scribbled something down. I could feel his eyes drilling into me, measuring every move, every correction. Yet the weight of his presence didn't shake me. It fueled me. I turned to check the headset connections, an instinct honed from years of dealing with sudden malfunctions. When I picked mine up, the cord slipped oddly in my hand. Something wasn't right. My fingers traced the wire and I found it, a clean cut in the insulation, nearly invisible unless you looked closely. The copper strands inside frayed, severed enough to distort sound, not enough to be noticed at first glance. My stomach dropped. This wasn't wear and tear, this was an accident, this was deliberate. Someone had tampered with the captain's headset. I masked the jolt of realization, keeping my movement steady as though nothing had changed. I switched to the backup headset, my voice level when I said, "Comms check." "Loud and clear," Ryan responded, unaware, or pretending to be. I clipped the damaged headset under the console, hidden for now, but the weight of its implication burned in my chest. This wasn't just doubt or prejudice. Someone had crossed into sabotage. The thought coiled in my mind like smoke. Who? Linda, with her quiet venom and whispered reassurances to passengers. Richard, sitting smug in his authority, pushing for perfection at any cost. Or someone else entirely, unseen but equally determined to see me fail. Richard's voice broke into my thoughts. "We'll need to push back on schedule, Captain. VIPs don't like delays." I turned my head slowly, meeting his gaze. "VIPs may not like turbulence either," I said evenly. "Or nav errors that weren't caught." His pen paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed scribbling. Ryan chuckled lightly, as though the tension amused him. Guess it's a good thing you caught that one. Wouldn't want to get lost out there. His tone carried no gratitude, only the insinuation that my correction was an exception, not the rule. I ignored him, focusing on the task. The hum of electronics filled the cockpit, steady, constant. But underneath, I heard something else, the echo of betrayal waiting, ready to strike again. As passengers continued boarding, I forced my breathing steady, outwardly calm. Inwardly, I catalogued every detail. The cut wire, the sloppy override, the way Linda had spoken to the passengers, Richard's sudden arrival with his thinly veiled warnings. This wasn't coincidence. This was pattern. I knew prejudice. I knew underestimation. But this was darker. Someone wasn't just hoping I would fail. They were engineering my failure. And if they were willing to start with a headset, what would they be willing to risk once we were in the air? The thought steeled me. I wasn't just carrying stripes on my shoulders. I was carrying lives. And I would not let sabotage, prejudice, or fear take them from me. I leaned forward, voice calm as I began the final sequence of checks. "Engine start in 10, I said. My tone gave nothing away, but in my chest, the storm was building. They wanted me broken. They wanted me erased. Instead, they had awakened something else entirely. The cockpit door closed with a thud, sealing off the chatter of boarding passengers. For a moment, I sat there in silence, staring at the neatly coiled but damaged headset hidden beneath the console. Its frayed copper glinted faintly under the instrument glow, mocking me. It wasn't a malfunction. It was intent. Someone had made a choice. Ryan hummed softly beside me, tapping his pen against the logbook, oblivious or pretending to be. Richard scribbled steadily behind us, the scratching of his pen relentless. I adjusted the mic on my backup headset and cleared my throat. "I'll step out for a moment before final prep." Ryan shrugged, unconcerned. Richard didn't look up. I left the cockpit, walking with measured calm down the narrow jet bridge. But inside my chest, tension coiled tight. I pulled out my phone, checking the time. 15 minutes before pushback. Not much, but enough. In a quiet corner by the service door, away from crew and passengers, I dialed a number I had memorized years ago. After 2 rings, the line clicked. "Marcus Reed," came the familiar voice, steady, warm, a grounding presence even through static. "It's me," I said quietly. My tone carried no pleasantries, only urgency. "Liv," he exhaled softly. "I was wondering when you'd call." There was comfort in hearing his voice. Marcus had been more than a colleague. He was a friend, a fellow pilot, one of the few who knew what it was like to fight battles invisible to most of the world. He was also deeply involved with the pilots' union, a man with access to the files and whispers that never made it to official reports. "I need information," I said, keeping my voice low. "Something's wrong. It's more than the usual doubt or bias. Someone tampered with my headset." Silence on the line for a heartbeat. Then his voice dropped. "That confirms it." "Confirms what?" I asked. He hesitated, then sighed. "There have been reports, not isolated. A pattern. Female captains, especially black women, being targeted. Not just undermined socially, but through deliberate interference. Maintenance errors, paperwork vanishing, performance reports altered." I felt the air leave my lungs. "And the company?" "Buried it," Marcus said flatly. "Dismissed every complaint as paranoia or incompetence. But I've collected the data. You're not the first, Liv, and you won't be the last unless something changes." My hand tightened around the phone. I turned slightly, glancing down the jet bridge to make sure no one was near. "Name's Marcus. Who's involved?" He didn't hesitate. "2 keep showing up again and again, Linda Harris and Richard Collins. Different incidents, different captains, but always their fingerprints on the margins. Either present when it happened or signing off afterward. It's not proof, but it's a pattern you can't ignore." I closed my eyes briefly. The weight of it pressed heavy. Linda, with her cutting smile and whispered poison. Richard, with his clipboard and thinly veiled threats. My instincts hadn't been wrong. Marcus's voice softened. Listen, Liv. This isn't just about you, it's systemic. You're flying into a storm bigger than weather, and if they can push you out, one of the youngest black female captains in the airline, they'll send a message to every other woman watching. Stay in your place. The truth of it struck deeper than any insult Linda could have thrown. This wasn't only about humiliation at a gate or whispers to passengers. It was a campaign, a machine designed to erase women like me from the left seat before we could become permanent fixtures. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady. What do I do? Document everything, Marcus said. Don't let them gaslight you. Keep records. And Liv, be careful. If they've escalated to sabotage, they're desperate. I leaned against the wall, the hum of the terminal faint through the door. For a moment, fatigue tugged at me. Bone-deep, soul-heavy fatigue of fighting the same battle on different fronts for years. But alongside it came something sharper, resolve. Thank you, Marcus, I said quietly. You don't have to thank me, he replied. Just don't let them win. You've earned those stripes more than anyone I know. Make them see it. The line went dead. I stood there for a few seconds, phone still in my hand, pulse thrumming. When I finally turned back toward the aircraft, my expression had hardened into calm resolve. The war wasn't invisible anymore. I could see the outlines now, the players, the stakes. I walked back down the jet bridge, each step measured. As I neared the cockpit door, Linda's voice drifted faintly from the galley. She was laughing with a pair of passengers, her tone sweet, professional. But beneath it, I heard the steel. The same steel that had told them not to worry because Ryan was the real pilot. I pushed the cockpit door open, settling back into my seat. Ryan glanced up. Everything good? Everything's fine, I said smoothly, strapping in. But inside, I carried Marcus's words like armor. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't just me. It was bigger, systemic, and it meant I couldn't afford even a single misstep. The headset cord under the console seemed to glimmer in the dim light, a reminder of the line I was walking. One mistake, one failure, and they wouldn't just call me unfit. They'd use me to justify shutting doors for every woman who came after. I rested my hands on the yoke, steady, composed. They wanted me to break. Instead, I would hold. And when the storm came, and I knew it would, I intended to meet it head-on. The boarding process had nearly finished when the first stir rippled through the cabin. A commotion at the gate, the unmistakable sound of rushed footsteps, clipped voices, and the swish of expensive suits. A group of men swept aboard, their presence drawing immediate attention even before the whispers began. Bank executives. Their tailored suits gleamed under the cabin lights, watches flashing gold and platinum as they checked the time impatiently. They were late, unapologetically so, carrying themselves with the arrogance of men convinced the world would always wait for them. I caught fragments of their conversation as they stepped into the forward cabin. At least they held the flight, one of them muttered. Progressive of Skyway, though, giving command to a diversity hire. He chuckled as if it were a joke, but his tone carried more venom than humor. The words cut through the air like a blade. I kept my expression neutral, but my knuckles tightened briefly on the checklist in my hand. Linda Harris was at their side in an instant, her smile warm, professional, dripping with flattery. "Gentlemen, welcome aboard," she purred, guiding them toward their leather seats in business class. "You'll be in excellent hands today." One of the executives arched a brow toward the cockpit door, his voice pitched just enough for those around him to hear. "So, the captain, Olivia Carter, was it? That's ambitious." His tone left no doubt about what he meant. Linda leaned closer, lowering her voice, but I still caught the words as I stood just inside the cockpit door, listening. "Don't worry," she whispered, echoing the poison she had already fed others. "Captain Carter is new in the role. Our first officer, Ryan Cooper, has far more experience. You're in very capable hands." The executives chuckled, settling into their seats, already pulling out phones and briefcases, dismissing me without a second thought. To them, I was a box checked on a corporate brochure. Nothing more. Inside, something twisted. Not rage. It was too familiar for rage. It was the steady, corrosive ache of being reduced again, of having every hour I had poured into this career erased by a single phrase: quota hire. I turned back into the cockpit, lowering myself into the captain's seat, the uniform a shield even as their words burned holes beneath it. Ryan slid in beside me, his smirk faint but visible. If he had heard Linda, he didn't protest. He didn't correct her. Behind us, Richard Collins entered, his clipboard clutched tight. He glanced at the executives, his smile thin and deferential, then shut the cockpit door behind him. "Pressure's high today," he remarked, settling into the jump seat. His gaze flicked to me, sharp, weighing. And I don't just mean the passengers. We began the final systems check. My hands moved with precision over the controls, every switch and dial familiar, grounding me against the murmurs outside. But midway through the sequence, a new warning blinked across the console. "Cabin pressure alert." The sound was soft, a chime more insistent than alarming, but it sent a jolt through me. Ryan frowned, leaning closer. "Could be a sensor glitch," he said casually, already reaching to reset the system. I stopped him with a hand, my voice low but firm. "Not until we know for sure." Richard leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "What's the delay?" "Cabin pressure irregularity," I replied. "We need maintenance to check it." Richard's jaw tightened. He lowered his voice, though the steel in it carried enough to slice through the air. "Fix it quietly, or you'll regret it." The words landed heavy, thick with implication. He wasn't asking. He was instructing. His meaning was clear. Don't make noise. Don't delay the flight. Don't anger the men in suits who thought their money outweighed safety. I felt the sting of Marcus's warning echo in my mind. They'll push you, Liv. They'll make you choose between protocol and survival, between their comfort and your conscience. I kept my voice calm, controlled. Safety isn't negotiable. Maintenance needs to take a look. Ryan shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "It could delay us, Captain. They're already late." I turned my head slowly, meeting his eyes. "Delays don't kill people. Pressure loss does." He said nothing more, but the silence carried his doubt loud enough. I picked up the comm and called for maintenance. My tone was clipped, professional, no tremor betraying the fury beneath. Within minutes, Frank Miller, a maintenance officer, climbed into the cockpit, his coveralls smelling faintly of fuel and oil. He leaned over the panel, running diagnostics, muttering under his breath as he traced the fault. Richard watched every movement, his pen poised but unmoving. "This is unnecessary," he muttered. Frank glanced up briefly, his expression neutral but his voice firm. "Valve miscalibrated. Could have triggered decompression at altitude." He adjusted the settings, recalibrating, then shut the panel with a firm click. "Good catch, Captain." The validation was small, but it landed like a spark in the storm. Richard's lips thinned. He said nothing, only scribbled something on his clipboard. Linda's voice floated faintly from the cabin outside, cheerful, oblivious to the tension brewing in the cockpit. As Frank left, I exhaled slowly, my face calm though my pulse still hammered. They had wanted me to ignore it, to risk lives for the sake of punctuality and pride. And when I hadn't, Richard had delivered his warning like a blade. But the truth was clear. I wasn't imagining the sabotage. I wasn't overreacting. Someone had touched systems, cut cords, tampered with valves. And every time, the pressure to ignore it came from the same direction. I glanced at the clock. We were minutes from departure. The executives sat smug in their seats, expecting luxury and punctuality. Linda had already primed them to believe Ryan was the real pilot. Richard sat behind me, waiting for any misstep he could twist into failure. And Ryan, beside me, wore his smirk like armor, quietly skeptical, quietly hoping I'd falter. The weight pressed in, thick, suffocating. But I had made my choice. I strapped in, adjusted the mic, and called the tower. My voice was calm, steady, the voice of command, even as the storm brewed inside. Skyway 162, requesting pushback. The engines hummed, the aircraft shuddered slightly, alive under our hands. Outside, the runway light stretched into the night like a path through darkness. They wanted me silent. They wanted me complicit. Instead, I was resolved. If this was their game, to corner me, undermine me, sabotage me, I would play it. But not on their terms, on mine. The executives thought they were the most important passengers on this plane. They were wrong. The most important passengers were the hundreds of lives who didn't know about cut wires or miscalibrated valves, who had placed their trust in me without ever seeing my face. And I refused to betray that trust, no matter what threats, whispers, or smirks they threw my way. The storm was coming, and I was ready. The engines rumbled beneath us, steady as a giant heart, but my hands hovered over the throttle without moving. The glow of the cockpit panels reflected off the glass, casting Ryan's face in cool light, his smirk faltering as he realized I wasn't calling for takeoff clearance. "Captain," he prompted, his voice tight. "Hold position," I said, firm, final. Through the headset, the tower's voice crackled. "Skyway 162, cleared for departure." I pressed the switch. "Negative, tower. Skyway 162 is holding, awaiting full clearance after secondary inspection." Ryan's head snapped toward me. "You can't be serious. They'll crucify us for the delay." The executives don't fly the plane," I cut in. My tone was calm, but steel ran beneath it. "Safety first." The cockpit door burst open before he could answer. Richard Collins loomed, his expression tight with controlled fury. "Captain Carter, what do you think you're doing? We are cleared to go." "Not until I finish my checks," I replied evenly. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, but the venom in it was sharp. "You're about to make enemies you cannot afford. Push this any further, and you won't command another flight." I met his stare without blinking. "Then let that be on record." But before he could respond, another ripple shifted the air. The cabin doors opened, and footsteps echoed, measured, deliberate. The hum of conversation in the business cabin stilled into silence. And then he appeared, Charles Whitman, CEO of Skyway Airlines. His presence filled the narrow space, his tailored suit impeccable, his silver hair combed with precision. He wasn't supposed to be here, not on this flight, not at this hour. But the weight of the bank executive's influence had pulled him onto this stage. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice low but resonant, addressing me directly. The murmurs of passengers, even from behind the closed cockpit door, seemed to hush as though the entire plane leaned in. "I've received complaints about delays. Is there a problem?" Richard straightened immediately, deferential, but I spoke before he could. "Yes," I said, projecting my voice so it carried. "Multiple system anomalies have occurred tonight. A cabin pressure valve was miscalibrated. A navigation error appeared during pre-check, and my primary headset was found tampered with. I will not depart until safety is guaranteed. The logs confirm this." With deliberate calm, I lifted the safety logbook, flipping to the relevant entries. My voice carried through the cockpit door as I read aloud, clear, unwavering. "Pressure valve miscalibration corrected at 1845. Navigation override corrected at 1910. Headset malfunction logged at 1912. Gasps rippled faintly from the cabin beyond. I knew passengers were listening, straining for fragments of the drama unfolding. Charles Whitman's eyes narrowed, sharp, intelligent. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but he recognized the weight of what I had said. "You're alleging sabotage? I'm stating facts," I replied. For a moment, silence reigned, and then applause. It started faint, from somewhere in economy, A few claps of passengers who had overheard. It spread, hesitant but real, until it echoed faintly through the sealed door. Passengers cheering not for me, perhaps, but for the truth that someone dared to speak aloud. The first taste of vindication. The first crack in the wall they had built around me. Ryan shifted uneasily, his smirk gone. Richard's jaw clenched, fury restrained only by the CEO's presence. Linda hovered near the cockpit entrance, her face pale, but her eyes sharp, calculating. Then, with surgical precision, she struck. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice smooth, professional. She held a slim folder in her manicured hands, pulling it from her clipboard as if she had prepared for this very moment. "If I may, these are documented observations from multiple flights. Records of Captain Carter's errors, minor perhaps, but repeated. Patterns of hesitation, missed timing, questionable judgment." She extended the folder toward Richard, who took it eagerly, his expression shifting from fury to satisfaction. "See?" Richard said, handing the file to Whitman. "We've tolerated insubordination long enough. This is a liability." The applause beyond the cockpit faded into uneasy murmurs, confusion spreading. Vindication twisted into doubt in an instant. My pulse quickened, though my face remained calm. This was their counterattack, planned, deliberate, timed to perfection. They had let me stand tall for a breath, only to strike harder when I thought the tide had turned. Charles Whitman flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable, the silence stretching like a blade between us all. I held my ground, uniform pressed, stripes gleaming under the panel lights. They thought they had cornered me, crushed the momentum with manufactured paper, but I had survived storms fiercer than this. Still, the sting was real. For every passenger who had clapped moments ago, another now leaned back in doubt. For every whisper of support, there was now a whisper of suspicion. It was the cruel rhythm I knew too well. Rise, fall, rise again. A sine wave of hope and despair. And they were determined to keep me on the downward stroke. But this story wasn't over. Not by a long flight. The air inside the cockpit felt like glass stretched too thin, ready to shatter with the slightest pressure. Charles Whitman's presence alone turned every breath into measured calculation. He flipped through Linda's carefully curated folder, page after page of supposed errors, his sharp eyes narrowing. The applause from the cabin outside had already faded into uncertain murmurs. Momentum, so briefly mine, was slipping through my hands. Then the cockpit door opened again. Frank Miller, the maintenance officer, climbed in, his coveralls smudged, his hands still streaked with grease. He looked from me to Richard, then to Whitman. His expression was serious, but not fearful. "Mr. Whitman," Frank said, addressing the CEO directly, "you should know this before any decision is made." He set a small device on the console, a diagnostic readout from his inspection. The cabin pressure valve was tampered with. It wasn't wear and tear. It was manually adjusted out of safe range. Captain Carter logged it correctly, and she prevented a potential decompression event at altitude. The words landed like thunder. The silence that followed was heavier than the engines at full thrust. Whitman's eyes lifted from the folder slowly, fixing on Frank. "You're certain?" "As certain as I am standing here," Frank said firmly. "If she hadn't caught it, we'd be flying with a time bomb. At 35,000 feet, this aircraft could have lost pressure. The outcome would not have been survivable." A sharp intake of breath came from behind me. Ryan Cooper, so casual, so dismissive only minutes ago, shifted in his seat. His smirk was gone, replaced by a pallor that drained the color from his face. He started, his voice catching, then louder, steadier. "He's right. Captain Carter did save the flight. When the nav system flagged earlier, I was about to enter the wrong sequence. She corrected me. If she hadn't been as precise as she was, we'd be compounding faults right now instead of sitting safe at the gate." His admission rang louder than Frank's report, because it came from someone who had every reason to keep silent. Ryan's voice cracked slightly, but he forced himself to finish. "She's the reason we're not in an emergency already." The murmur from the cabin outside swelled again, this time stronger, less hesitant. Passengers might not know the details, but they could hear the cracks in the narrative. I sat still, back straight, face composed, though my chest burned with a mixture of relief and restrained fury. This was vindication, yes, but vindication wrung out drop by drop, after humiliation and slander. Richard's face stiffened, his pen frozen mid-air. Linda's lips parted, her practiced smile faltering as color drained from her cheeks. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. But they weren't ready to collapse. Not yet. Richard found his voice first, smooth as always, though the strain was audible. "With all due respect, Mr. Whitman, malfunctions happen. It's possible the valve was adjusted incorrectly during the last service. That doesn't mean sabotage, and it doesn't excuse a captain undermining the chain of command." Linda chimed in quickly, desperate to regain footing. "Exactly. And while Captain Carter did respond appropriately this time, the records still show a pattern of overcautious behavior, delays, hesitations, refusals to follow through. This could set a dangerous precedent if we allow fear to dictate operation." The audacity of their spin nearly stole my breath. They had been caught in their lie, exposed by both maintenance and first officer, and yet they twisted the blade toward me again, framing my vigilance as weakness. Whitman's gaze shifted between them, his jaw tight. He closed the folder with deliberate finality, then handed it back to Linda without a word. She faltered, clutching it as though unsure whether to be relieved or afraid. "Captain Carter," Whitman said finally, his voice measured, "you've made your point clear. Safety will not be compromised on my aircraft. You'll proceed as you see fit." The weight of his words should have been victory, and in a way, it was. A corporate CEO had sided with me, not them, but his phrasing, "made your point clear," was calculated, political. He hadn't dismissed Linda or Richard. He hadn't stripped their authority. The battlefield was only shifting, not conquered. Behind him, Ryan exhaled, shoulders loosening slightly. For the first time since briefing, his eyes held no mockery, only the faint shadow of respect. Frank gave me a nod before slipping out of the cockpit, leaving silence in his wake. Linda and Richard exchanged a glance, their unity brittle but unbroken. They had been exposed, yes, their story fractured, but they were still standing. And as long as they stood, the fight wasn't over. I looked straight ahead, hands steady on the yoke, though the plane remained motionless. In the reflection of the glass, I caught my own eyes, calm but burning. Vindication wasn't enough, not yet. The passengers outside were hushing again, waiting, sensing the drama wasn't finished. They were right. The sine wave of emotion had lifted them, given them triumph in watching injustice cracked open. But the fall was coming, and I knew Linda and Richard would strike again, harder, more desperate. For now, though, I had held. The truth had surfaced. The applause might not return, but the seed of doubt in their scheme had been planted. It was a win. Fragile, fleeting, but still a win. And the war wasn't over. Not by a long stretch. The cabin still buzzed faintly from the echoes of Frank's revelation. Passengers shifted in their seats, conversations low but spirited. Vindication hung in the air like the first rays of dawn after a storm. I kept my expression neutral, hands steady on the controls. But inside there was a fragile satisfaction. For once, the truth had surfaced where everyone could see. But victories like these never lasted long in my world. The first blow came swiftly. The executives, those smug bankers in their tailored suits, unbuckled their seatbelts with a deliberate snap. Their leader, a tall man with a voice that carried the arrogance of money, stood and announced loudly enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "We're done here. We'll be taking the Delta flight instead." Skyway clearly doesn't have its house in order. The words rippled outward. A performance meant less for me than for the dozens of listening ears. Another jab, another public slight. Linda was at their side instantly, fussing over their luggage, offering polite apologies with a smile sharpened to cut. Richard moved too, though slower, his face carefully schooled into neutrality. I didn't say a word. I simply watched as they strutted down the aisle, trailed by their entourage, dragging tension with them like static. For a few tense minutes, the cabin seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. Passengers whispered, uncertain, wondering if they should be worried too. And then, news filtered back through a murmuring flight attendant who had one eye on her phone. The Delta flight those bankers had fled to? Diverted by storms along its route, exactly as I had flagged earlier in briefing. Hours of delays. When the announcement reached the passengers still on my flight, relief swept through the cabin like a tide. A few chuckles broke out. A couple of passengers even clapped, as if the universe itself had vindicated me again. I felt the surge, the lift of their trust, fragile but real. For once they saw me not as a quota, but as a captain who had called the storm before it struck. Hope rose in the sine wave again, cresting high. But the descent came almost immediately. I was finalizing clearances, the engines humming with readiness, when Ryan shifted in his seat. His hand pressed to his stomach, his complexion pale. "Captain," he muttered, his voice strained. I can't. I need to step off." I froze, turning toward him slowly. "What are you talking about?" "My stomach," he grimaced. "Something I ate. I'm not fit to fly. I'll call for a replacement, but..." He let the words trail, the weight of them obvious. My chest tightened. Without a first officer, regulations bound me. I could not take off, not with passengers aboard. Behind us, Richard leaned forward, his satisfaction thinly veiled. "Well, Captain," he said softly, almost gleefully, "without a first officer, you're grounded." The words echoed like a gavel. The fragile triumph of moments ago crumbled. I could almost feel the cabin's mood shifting, passengers sensing the delay, the unraveling. From the high of vindication to the low of dread, another plunge down the sine wave of this cursed journey. I locked eyes with Ryan. For a moment, I searched for sincerity. Was it real pain or something else? His gaze darted away, and the doubt grew claws. "Convenient timing," I said, my voice flat. He swallowed hard, avoiding my stare. "It's not my choice, Captain. I can't risk collapsing mid-flight. Regulations." Richard's smirk deepened. "He's right, you know. A sick first officer is a liability. Better to stand down." The implication was clear. They had found their checkmate. I had weathered sabotage, humiliation, accusations, and still stood. But all it took was one convenient illness, and the flight was finished before it began. The applause from earlier felt distant now, replaced by the low murmur of anxious passengers. I imagined their thoughts. First the executives storm off, now the crew is falling apart. Can we trust this airline at all? I tightened my grip on the yoke, though the engines remained idle. Every part of me screamed to fight, to find a way forward. But rules were rules, and without Ryan, my wings were clipped. Linda appeared at the cockpit door, her expression smooth, her voice syrup sweet. "Captain, should I inform the passengers we'll be deplaning?" I glanced at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. I saw the glint in her eyes, the satisfaction, the thrill of victory. This was her play as much as Richard's. Not yet, I thought. Not yet. I turned back to the controls, keeping my face calm, even as the weight of their trap pressed against me. Somewhere deep inside, I could feel the storm building again. The fall now complete, the valley deep. But valleys had a way of leading to climbs. And if they thought grounding me tonight was their victory, they had underestimated the one thing they could never sabotage: resolve. For now, though, the passengers stirred, the CEO frowned, and Richard leaned back with the air of a man who believed the game was already won. The sine wave had plunged again. The question was, how long before it rose? For a long, suffocating moment, silence reigned in the cockpit. Ryan sat hunched, one hand pressed to his stomach, the other fumbling with his headset. Richard leaned back with his pen poised like a dagger, savoring the inevitability of my grounding. Linda hovered in the doorway, her expression polished into false concern, but her eyes gleamed with quiet triumph. Passengers murmured outside, their voices restless, anxious. The momentum of hope had collapsed again, and then, footsteps. Steady, purposeful. Not the dragging shuffle of crew, not the impatient stomp of executives. Firm, familiar. The cockpit door swung open, and there he was, Marcus Reed. Not in jeans and a jacket, as he had been earlier when we spoke, but in full Skyway uniform. His stripes gleamed under the dim lights, his cap tucked neatly under his arm. "I heard you might need a first officer," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to cut through the tension. My chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with sudden, overwhelming relief. "Marcus," I breathed, barely disguising the crack in my voice. Richard's face stiffened. "This isn't regulation. He's not—" "He is," Marcus interrupted smoothly, handing over a slip of paper. "I signed in on standby before the flight closed. Paperwork filed, medical cleared. Check the timestamp." Richard scanned the document, his jaw tightening further. It was legitimate. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his hand still pressed to his stomach, his pale face betraying both guilt and shame. I'll step off then," he muttered, unable to meet my gaze. Linda tried to recover, her voice syrupy. Well, what a coincidence. How fortunate for us all. But Marcus ignored her. He stepped into the right seat, sliding into place with a confidence that steadied the entire cockpit. His presence filled the space differently than Ryan's ever had. Not smug, not undermining, but grounding, like the rhythm of a drumbeat. "Ready when you are, Captain," Marcus said, glancing at me with a small, knowing nod. For the first time that night, the tension in my chest loosened. We weren't grounded anymore. I keyed the mic, my voice firm, unwavering. "Tower, Skyway 162 ready for departure, requesting clearance." The response came swift. "Skyway 162, cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Engines roared as we taxied down the runway. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky, the long stretch of tarmac glowing like a path to freedom. Passengers pressed back into their seats, nervous but hopeful, sensing the shift. The nose lifted, wheels leaving Earth behind. For a heartbeat, everything was still, the climb smooth, the ascent steady. The cabin filled with the familiar rumble of power, the feeling of flight embracing us all. And then, chaos. The storm hit like a fist. Thunder cracked so close it rattled the panels. Lightning strobed outside, flashing white against the glass. The aircraft shuddered violently, thrown side to side by turbulence so fierce it felt like invisible hands were tearing at the fuselage. Gasps erupted in the cabin, followed by screams. Over the intercom, shouts turned to cries, then to prayers. Some passengers clutched armrests until their knuckles turned white. Others buried their faces in hands. A child's voice pierced through, a sharp wail of terror that cut deeper than the turbulence itself. "Brace!" Marcus barked, steadying the panel with one hand while adjusting controls with the other. I gripped the yoke, my entire body locked into focus. The plane dropped suddenly, stomachs lurching, the screams swelling into hysteria. Overhead bins rattled, luggage shifting violently. "Altitude drop, 600 feet, Marcus called, scanning the instruments. "Wind shear warning, gusts at 70 knots. "Hold steady," I said through gritted teeth, voice steady despite the chaos. "We ride it out." Another violent jolt slammed us sideways. Ryan, still in the jump seat, groaned and clutched his stomach harder. Richard's clipboard clattered to the floor, his mask of control cracking as he gripped the seat arms, his face pale. Linda's scream echoed faintly from the cabin, the polished veneer of professionalism shattered. But Marcus and I held steady, The turbulence roared around us, the storm battering every seam of the aircraft. Lightning lit the cockpit in ghostly flashes, thunder rolling like cannon fire. The instruments jittered, warning chimes layering over one another like a discordant symphony. Yet amid the chaos, a rhythm took hold. My breathing aligned with the yoke's subtle resistance, Marcus's voice calling readings like a steady drumbeat. Together, we became a counterpoint to the storm, a human anchor against nature's fury. "Altitude stabilizing," Marcus called, his voice calm despite the chaos. 2,000-foot gain. "Maintain climb," I answered, hands iron on the yoke. We pushed through another violent pocket. The cabin behind us, a chorus of fear, sobs, prayers, whispered bargains with God. And still, we climbed. Finally, the turbulence softened. Just a fraction, but enough. The chimes slowed, the shaking eased. The storm still raging, but no longer tearing us apart. Marcus exhaled slowly, his voice low. "We're through the worst of it." I nodded, but my grip remained firm, because I knew storms had layers, and this one had not yet finished testing us. Outside, lightning still flashed, illuminating the night in jagged bursts. Inside, passengers clung to one another, the echoes of their fear lingering heavy in the air. But for the first time since the humiliation at the gate, hope bloomed again. Fragile, flickering, but alive, because we were still flying. The cockpit lights flickered as another bolt of lightning slashed across the sky. Rain hammered against the windshield like fists trying to break through. Every bone in my body felt the storm, yet my hands on the yoke remained steady. This was no longer just about flying. It was survival, pure and raw. Marcus's voice was calm, his tone the lifeline anchoring us. "Altitude 32,000, gusts holding at 60 knots. Maintain course," I answered, my voice, even though the aircraft lurched violently again. The storm wasn't easing. It was tightening, like a predator circling for the final strike. Then the alarm blared. A shrill, piercing warning that made every nerve in me snap to attention. The engine panel lit red. Ice detected. Engine performance degraded. Marcus's eyes shot to mine. "We're picking up ice in the intakes." I scanned the gauges. The left engine's RPM fluctuated dangerously. Power output dipping, climbing, then dipping again. A flameout was seconds away if the ice choked it completely. The cabin behind us erupted in renewed panic as the plane jolted downward. Screams pierced the intercom, the sound of prayer and despair mixing like a desperate chorus. "Engine 2 at risk of stall," Marcus reported, his voice clipped but not panicked. "Anti-ice system, full power," I ordered. My fingers flew across the controls, activating the de-icing equipment, but the warning didn't clear. Ice was building faster than the system could burn it away. Richard, pale and trembling in the jump seat, found his voice. "We need to turn back. Divert immediately before we lose power." "Divert into what?" I snapped, my eyes locked on the gauges. "Every surrounding corridor is storm-locked. We go back, we risk worse." Richard shrank into silence, clutching the seat. And then Marcus's phone buzzed, faint under the roar of the storm. He frowned, glanced at it, and his expression shifted to shock. He tilted the screen toward me. It was a message from Ryan. "They forced me to step down. Said if I didn't, they'd bury me. They wanted Olivia to fail. I'm sorry." My chest tightened. So it hadn't been food poisoning. It had been coercion. Ryan had been another pawn in their game, his cowardice weaponized against me. Marcus muttered, "They set this whole thing up." His voice hardened. "And still you're standing." I didn't respond. I couldn't afford to. My entire being was focused on the controls, on keeping the aircraft alive. The left engine coughed, sputtered, the sound reverberating through the frame. The warning light blinked brighter. The sine wave of emotion crashed through the cabin, hope tumbling into fear, hearts dropping with every lurch of the aircraft. I drew a deep breath, my voice steady, commanding. "We're descending. Manual controls. Altitude? Marcus asked. 24,000, I answered. Warmer air will melt the ice. The yoke fought me, every gust slamming against my arms, but I leaned into it with the strength of every hour I had trained, every doubt I had endured, every sneer I had survived. My stripes weren't decorations. They were scars forged into steel. Hold on, I said, not just to Marcus, but to every soul strapped into this aircraft. The descent was brutal. The plane dropped like a roller coaster, screams from the cabin rising with every dip. Luggage slammed in overhead bins. Cups spilled. Prayers grew louder. For a moment, the storm seemed determined to rip us apart, to remind us of our fragility against nature's fury, but then the gauges steadied. Ice began to melt. The left engine's RPM climbed, power stabilizing. The warning light flickered, then dimmed, fading back into the steady green of survival. Marcus let out a sharp breath. Engine stabilized. She's holding. A wave of relief surged through me, but I didn't loosen my grip. Not yet. The storm wasn't finished. Another blast of turbulence rocked us, but this time my body anticipated it. I rode the yoke like a seasoned rider taming a wild beast, guiding us not through the storm but with it, leaning where it pushed, cutting where it faltered. The passengers screamed, then gasped, then slowly, so slowly, fell quieter as the violence eased. The sine wave rose again, fear bleeding into hope, trembling into cautious belief. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through. The clouds thinned, the lightning dimmed. A patch of open sky yawned before us, vast and breathtaking as though the heavens themselves had parted in reluctant mercy. The aircraft leveled, the hum of the engine strong, steady, alive. For a moment, silence reigned, and then, from the cabin, applause. It started hesitant, scattered, then grew into thunder that rivaled the storm itself. Passengers clapped, cheered, cried. Relief poured out of them like floodgates breaking open. Marcus leaned back, sweat beading his forehead, his chest rising and falling heavily. He shot me a look of fierce pride. You did it, Liv. I allowed myself the smallest exhale, the tightest smile. No, we did. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. Storms came in many forms, and while I had beaten nature tonight, the human storm, the one crafted by Linda, Richard, and the system behind them, still brewed. For now, though, the passengers were safe. The sine wave had carried them from terror to triumph, from despair to elation. And in that fragile space of calm, I reminded myself why I wore these stripes. Not for them, not for approval, but for the lives I carried. And for the little girl inside me who once dreamed of flying when the world said she never could. The storm finally lay behind us, shrinking into a wall of darkness that pulsed faintly with lightning as if reluctant to release its prey. Ahead stretched the approach lights, steady beacons leading us home. My hands held the yoke firm, but my voice was calm as I guided the plane lower, step by careful step. Flaps 20, Marcus called, his tone steady, reverent. Flaps 20, I confirmed. The landing gear locked with a satisfying thud. The city glowed beneath us, scattered with diamonds of light. After hours of tension, fear, humiliation, and survival, the sight of runway 27 shining straight ahead felt like salvation itself. Skyway 162, cleared to land, the tower's voice crackled. I exhaled, not relief, but resolve. Landing. The descent was smooth, controlled, every correction precise. The engines hummed, no longer fighting ice or turbulence, but guiding us faithfully. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a muted roar, the brakes engaging, the plane slowing, until the storm outside our windows was only rain dripping off wings instead of fury tearing at them. Then it happened. Applause. It started timidly, as if passengers weren't sure it was appropriate yet. Then it grew, spreading row by row until the cabin thundered with clapping, cheers, and even sobs of gratitude. A wave of sound rolled forward, crashing into the cockpit with a force greater than any storm. I allowed myself one long, silent breath. We had made it. Marcus grinned, shaking his head. "You just saved on 62 lives, Liv. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." But even as he spoke, I knew the story wasn't ending here. Storms didn't just rage in skies, they brewed in headlines. And already, the media machine had been primed with one narrative: diversity hire delays flight. Yet now they had no choice but to write another. By the time we taxied to the gate, the flashes had already begun. Reporters, tipped off by the executives who had abandoned us earlier, swarmed the terminal. They had come expecting to document a scandal, but the whispers spreading through passengers and crew told a different story. Phones were out, videos already uploading, voices narrating. She saved us. She fought them. She flew us through hell. The first headline to roll across a waiting tablet was bold, undeniable. Black female captain saves 162 lives in mid-air storm battle. The twist of fate was almost poetic. They had prepared to bury me with words. Instead, words became my shield. But for Richard and Linda, the storm had just begun. As passengers disembarked, many shook my hand, some with tears in their eyes. A child whispered, "Thank you, Captain," before being carried off by her mother. Each one was proof, not of my victory, but of the lives intact, because I refused to break. Then security arrived. 2 officers stepped into the jet bridge, their expressions grim, their focus locked on Richard Collins and Linda Harris. Richard sputtered, clutching his clipboard as if it could shield him. "This is absurd. I was ensuring order, safety." "Save it," one officer cut him off, taking the clipboard from his hand. "We have evidence of tampering with safety equipment, corroborated by maintenance reports and passenger testimony." Linda tried to retreat, her practiced smile cracking. "This is a misunderstanding. Her words cut short as another officer produced the headset with the severed wire. Frank Miller stood behind them, his testimony already recorded. The passengers who lingered at the gate watched with open satisfaction as Richard and Linda were escorted away, their power stripped, their masks shattered. For once, accountability wasn't swept under the rug. And then came the final voice, the one no one could ignore. Charles Whitman, CEO of Skyway Airlines, stood before the press with cameras flashing. His tone was sharp, his posture resolute. "Tonight, the actions of Captain Olivia Carter saved every soul aboard Skyway 162. What she endured, from sabotage to discrimination, is unacceptable in this company, in this industry, in this world. Effective immediately, I am initiating a full investigation into internal misconduct, and reforms will follow. Safety and equality are not negotiable." The words reverberated through the terminal. Passengers clapped again. Crew members exchanged glances. For years, whispers of bias had lived in shadows. Tonight, they had been dragged into the light. But I didn't stay for the speeches. As Whitman addressed the press, I slipped quietly from the cockpit, my cap low, my uniform damp with the sweat of storms both inside and out. I walked down the jet bridge past reporters too focused on the spectacle to notice me. I didn't need the spotlight. I never had, because change had already begun. Not with declarations, not with applause, but with the undeniable truth of survival. The system had tried to break me. Instead, it was forced to bend. And as I stepped into the cool night air beyond the terminal, I whispered to myself words no headline could capture. The sky belongs to everyone.